Rococo ends in the letters CO, just as the colonial begins with them, and the thought bubble inflated by this exhibition is irretrievably tethered to that coincidence, and from recognizing that the processes leading to the occupation of Indigenous Australia were incremental and enacted in part in the overlap produced by the collapse of the temporal frontiers of the Rococo into those of the colonial. Rococo Colonial operates within a knowledge of dates and events not usually associated with the cartographical flourishes of British map-making. Understandings that link us to a wider regional discourse in which events consequent to the history of Australia played out earlier and in places not readily coupled with it, such as the occupation of Manila by the English in 1762, during which troops under the command of Brigadier General William Draper looted from the library of the Baroque Church of St. Augustine navigational charts and maps, subsequently relied upon by Cook and other English seafarers in the forays they were to make into the Pacific Ocean. This project accepts as a given that the narrative of the colonization of Australia by force of arms is complex, that it became probable centuries earlier than the accepted date when, coincidentally, in yet another southern summer, only not that of 1788, but that of 1488, Bartolomé Diaz became the first European to sail around the tip of Africa. The critical faculty is most engaging when the aridity and exactitude of scholarship is moistened by poetry and rendered winsome by speculation. As a project, RocoColonial was conceived of on Gadigal land, and further to this essential acknowledgement is another, the realization that complexity now occupies the place in art, particularly in its institutional sites, that was once taken up by the pornographic. Shunned, ostracized, and proscribed, it is mostly considered an offense to lack transparency, accessibility, and facility, or to produce an outcome that does not devolve into the vexatious binary of victim and perpetrator. Density and convolution are obscenities to the easy digestibility required by the commodity cycle of art under late capital, because they inhibit facile consumption. RocoColonial, among other things, engages with the idea that conquest, from the perspective of the Dahawal-speaking peoples of the Sydney Basin, became inevitable when, with the assistance of a pilot he picked up in the southeast African entrepot of Malindi, Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut, in the present-day Indian state of Kerala. Referencing these histories and conceding their relevance to us entwines our story more closely with those of the global south and of our immediate region, and establishes a framework for kinship, past, present, and future, with them, and not necessarily with the North and the status quo of post-empire coloniality. Rococo and colonial are both generally applied as pejorative terms. Like femme, they belong to a contested taxonomy that is characterized by slipperiness with sharp edges. As much slur as definition, the Rococo and the Colonial as descriptions are usually applied to neatly cleave periods of time and connoisseurship. The presumption that historical moments and their stylistic properties can be cleanly separated, one from another, thwarts the opportunity to engage creatively with the multiplicities that flourish in the literal zone, cohering around epochal intersection. As an artist-initiated project, RocoColonial visualizes a context for contemporary Australian practices at the juncture of the paradigms Rococo and Colonial, connecting them to a wider speculative world of multiple concurrent histories. This project seeks not so much to overturn the established art historical conventions that have been transmitted to us by scholars, but merely to embroider them with a thread less linear, challenging the singularity of sanctioned narratives, and where possible to rewrite them for multiple voices is a strategy pursued by the artists whose works are referenced here. The Rococo, as historians mostly conclude, was a fluid, highly ornamental and ambiguous style that, according to some, first appeared in France somewhere in the late 17th or early 18th centuries. Among other things, it articulated a comprehensive approach to the unity of art and design. As well as incorporating sculpture and painting, it promoted new strategies of furniture, such as the chaise longue, while carpets, ceramics, and wallpaper contributed to the propagation of sumptuous interior spaces. For want of a more appropriate word than style, this period synthesized hitherto largely separate forms of artifact production, like cabinetry, upholstery, and weaving, into refined forms of placemaking. Derived from the French term rocaille, rococo was initially applied to a form of shell and rock garden ornamentation, but later became closely associated with chinoiserie, reflecting the expanding trade with East Asia and the unrestrained growth of now ubiquitous worldwide production and supply chains for luxury goods, rare commodities, and exotic foods and spices. The commencement of coloniality in Australia cannot be conveniently or credibly sundered from this earlier wending tale of power, venality, and exploitation. Doing so perpetuates our continued colonization, not just materially, but in the topography of the imagination, while alienating us from kin with whom we share a common chronicle of invasion masquerading as settlement. Then, as now, the forces of economic and social inequality were accelerating, displacing not only indigenous peoples in the newly conquered territories, but also large numbers of unenfranchised, marginalized, and disempowered peoples in the homelands of the conquistadors, or settlers, as they are sometimes so disingenuously named. Although the arrival of an English garrison and several hundred convicts initiated the first phase of the physical dispossession of Australia's original peoples, this was, and remains part of, a larger, unabated arc of violence. This project considers how the art of the Rococo introduced radically new concepts of reality, in which dreams, fantasy, and foreboding are constantly present elements, and where play and life are often indistinguishable, and it contextualizes them in the practices of Australian artists working today. It assumes that the colonial continues, albeit in a different guise, and that we are, in effect, self-colonizing ourselves by further constructing and privileging new elites. Contemporary scholarship has now begun to identify behind the facade of the Rococo's affected elegance and anxiety, a prescient and justified expectation of impending doom. Now, as then, issues of globalization, unrestrained capital, and the systematic abuse of power by a ruling clique was corroding faith in institutions and threatening the established order of things. Was it a coincidence that in 1770, while Cook was closing the gaps in the map of Australia on the globe of the world, on its other side, in a lavish and wasteful ceremony, Marie Antoinette was marrying the future Louis XVI of France? Or that Jenny Watson and Jean Honoré Fragonard painted blindfolded young women in pinafores? Coincidence, as RocoColonial attests, has a way of revealing patterns in the fabric of both memory and forgetfulness.